Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, we want to begin, as we always do, on time. I'd like to welcome everyone to this book talk. We're honored today to have two members of the CISA family return. And let me begin by welcoming back to CISA Ambassador Greta Holtz, whose long and distinguished diplomatic career is marred only by the time she spent having to attempt to herd the cats that are the CISA faculty during her time with us as our Vice Chancellor and as a valued member of the faculty. Ambassador Holtz, I'd like to welcome you back to CISA and turn the floor over to you to give us a little bit of context and background on today's book talk.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Parker. Jay, I've got to say my year at CISA was one of the best I spent in my 35-year career as a diplomat. I enjoyed so much working with you, the other faculty, Dr. Bell, Mike Bell. I learned so much from all of you guys. I wish I had been able to stay longer, but it was an intense year and loved every minute. So go CISA is what I say. So I'm delighted and honored to have been asked to introduce Steve and talk a little bit about his book and the context in which he's written this book. Steve and I met in Iraq sometime between 2009 and 2010 when I was there. I think Steve may have done more than one gig in Iraq, but I found him to be brilliant, operational. He was able to work with his PRT counterpart, so Provincial Reconstruction Team, and I liked and admired and respected how he worked with his Iraqi teammates and with the Iraqis. And if I could characterize Steve's MO in Iraq, it was every minute that you don't spend with an Iraqi to understand the terrain is a wasted minute. So he had vast responsibilities, but his commitment to the quality of his relationships with the other Americans and with the Iraqis was something that I would like to emulate. So Steve is also a CISA graduate. He was a CT, Counterterrorism Fellow, class of 2011. And he wrote his thesis on the topic described by the story in his book, which he will talk about today. The book, which I was also honored to have read an early, what do you call it, like a manuscript, really tells the story of Steve's time in Iraq and his experience with his interpreters and the Iraqi teammates that he had out there during full spectrum combat operations. The timing for this book could not be more important, not be more propitious. As the US pulls all of its troops out of Afghanistan, we are faced with a very similar situation in that we have approximately 17 to 20,000 interpreters and a large number of family members who we really, really should not leave behind at the mercy of the Taliban, of ISIS Khorasan, and of Al-Qaeda. We have done this before. We do not need or want helicopters on the roof evacuating people or boatloads. There will be no boats out of Afghanistan, but we need to have the reputation that we take care of the people that work with us and for us. And so we will need interpreters again in our lifetimes. And so the timing of this book and the story that it tells humanizes some of the people that we are now going to be trying to get out of Afghanistan. So very similar situation in Iraq. The interpreters and other employees, local employees, faced threats, death threats, were killed by terrorist organizations in Iraq. And the interpreters and their families face the same exact thing in Afghanistan. So as Baghdad Underground Railroad points out in the book, there are these 17,000 Afghan interpreters and 7,000 at-risk family members who remain behind. The special immigrant visa program that the State Department has set up, it's slow. We've sent a few more consular officers to Kabul to process, but really the the majority of the work is done by Department of Homeland Security. It's in the screening of these people. So we need to ramp up that process. I know a lot of very good people are working on trying to fix it and speed it up. But Steve is an expert in this. He's been an advocate for his Iraqi interpreters and teammates. And I think that's really all I'll say. I'd like to get into over to Steve, and he can talk about his book, and then we'll do the Q&A. So I think Dr. Parker will be the moderator. Sorry, dog barking. And we will use the chat function to pose the questions. So Dr. Parker, I believe I'll turn it back to you for the ground rules.
Thank you, Ambassador Holtz. And of course, as we all know, it is not an actual class, book talk, or seminar or meeting if you don't have at least one dog barking in the background over the course of the last 14 to 18 months. It's a great pleasure to have you back, and it's a great pleasure to welcome home Colonel Retired Steve Miska, class of 2011. Colonel Steve Miska retired from active service in the U.S. Army in 2015 after a distinguished 25-year career that included everything from teaching economics at the U.S. Military Academy to 3 combat tours to service on the National Security Council. In the course of his time in Iraq, as he'll discuss with us today, he began working on this issue of caring for and ensuring the safety of those who worked on behalf of coalition forces as interpreters and other roles. And he will be giving us some of the details of that effort, not only in terms of the historic undertakings, but where things are today and where they need to go in the future. Steve is currently the executive director of First Amendment Voice, which seeks to advance freedom of speech and civil discourse. He's advisor to a number of nonprofit organizations. He is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, of Cornell's University's graduate program, and of the College of International Security Affairs. After he presents his discussion of his book, we'll have a question and answer session. And what I would ask each of you to do is to provide your questions in the chat function. I will moderate those to ensure that we get everyone and that we do so in a timely manner. But one of the advantages of using this sometimes burdensome format is that as you enter your questions, we can capture them in the chat function, and with any questions that are left remaining when our time is over, we will harvest those questions, forward them to Steve, and he has agreed to follow up with answers even after the Q&A session has wrapped. Also, you are all currently muted and off camera. Those of you who have been going through the virtual teaching experience know that wherever 2 or more are gathered together, there will be frozen screens and shaky and unstable bandwidth. So we want to ensure that we preserve our technical capability for today's speaker. So without further ado, Steve Miska, welcome home to CISA.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Thank you, Ambassador Holtz, as well. It really feels like I'm coming home and coming full circle here. It's I just realized this morning that it's been 10 years since I left CISA. I can't believe that much time has gone by. And as Ambassador Holtz mentioned, we met in Iraq and first started experiencing this together there before she and others tried to encourage me to go to DC and help out at the NSC. And then Jay, as you know, we have even a longer history together. I was a new instructor in the Department of Social Sciences when you were the director of international relations and Soch, and so that goes back to, geez, end of the 90s. So that's more than 20 years now, Jay. So I guess we're both getting old. I don't know. It's just wonderful to be home in the CISA family, though. I have really strong memories of my time, especially with my classmates and the professors, the travel that we did, but also I have stayed in touch with many of my classmates. I visited a classmate in Amman. I visited a classmate in Guatemala, in the Bahamas as well. So I'm probably missing a few of my classmates out there, but it was a really meaningful experience. I did some of the deepest intellectual dives I've ever done in CISA. The reason I wrote the book was because I came back from Iraq with this burning issue, and I was trying to make sense of what I thought at the time was the special immigrant visa. And I thought that would be the subject of my thesis. But as I started getting into it, I realized that it was bigger than the special immigrant visa, and that our practitioners in the field need a toolkit of other policy options to safeguard their most important and most vulnerable colleagues in the field, indigenous colleagues. And so I realized that, you know, we've got tools out there that we could apply. And so I started thinking about that at CISA, and I molded over in classes like yours, Jay, and other classes. And it didn't matter what class I was in. It could be a history class, grand strategy. It could be a theory class. It could be something else. I was always thinking about this issue, and it was with a different lens in each class that helped me better explore it and try to make sense of it. But the book tells the story from, I weeded out all the policy wonk stuff from the book and just tried to tell a good story about what actually happened in Baghdad at the height of sectarian cleansing in 2006 and 2007. And our closest partners were being literally killed out from underneath us. And it didn't matter if they were Sunni, Shia, Kurd, they were collaborating with the occupiers. And it was really risky. Jack was one of my closest interpreters. They all had nom de guerres, combat nicknames, because if you knew their Iraqi name, you could trace back to what village they were from, what tribe they were from, and their families were potentially at risk. They all wore face masks. When we went on patrol, I gave my interpreters weapons, and because everybody needed to defend themselves in the fight. It was really lethal, and especially for them. So Jack was killed in Balad in early 2007, and 2 weeks later, Nadal, a store owner on our base, was killed. Jack was killed by Sunni insurgents in Balad. Nadal was killed by Shia militia in Baghdad. And a couple weeks after that, George Packer's article in the New Yorker came out, and it was a 15,000-word article with a one-word title, and that title was Betrayed. And it was just a scathing indictment of the lack of policy options, the lack of just attention and caring that we were devoting to our most trusted Iraqi colleagues. And so that for me was really an awakening. I could not look myself in the mirror every day if I was not doing something to try to protect our partners. These guys were our cultural ears, eyes, and mouthpieces. They helped us understand the contours of the population. They saved our lives in many cases. They would warn us of IEDs and other instances where we might be at risk, or just help us from not doing any harm by coaching us about Iraqi culture. So they were vital to the mission. We couldn't have done it without them. And as a result of the risk, we and the special immigrant visa that had just been passed, my team started trying to make sense of it. We started trying to understand our bureaucracy, and what we quickly realized was we couldn't navigate our own bureaucracy, so no Iraqi was going to be able to do it. And worse than that, there was a catch-22 in the actual process. Embassy Baghdad at the time decided to close its doors to the final interview, which was the last step in the process before approval for the special immigrant visa. And so they directed that any applicants would have to go to Amman, Jordan. Well, because of the Iraqi refugee crisis the Jordanians had, they had closed the border to Iraqis. So it was a built-in catch-22 in the process. So we literally had to navigate the bureaucracy while also doing all the other things we were supposed to be doing, and try to process these packets. And it took my staff a concerted 3 months of effort before we got our first packet approved. And it also involved everything from a general officer letter or letter of recommendation, background checks, all the background checks that you would expect from anybody working so closely with Americans, and then finally chief of mission approval at the embassy. And so the Iraqis, they had to come up with alibis for how they were going to get to Jordan. And it was very lethal to do that. The road through Anbar province to Jordan was called the Highway of Death. And so anybody traveling that road was at risk of getting attacked by Sunni insurgents and Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. So that was highly risky. But the other option was fly out of Baghdad International Airport, which was very infiltrated by Shia militia, Jaish al-Mahdi in particular. And so it was super risky for these guys. Many of them did not let their families know what they did for a living, because a family member might inadvertently slip through the wrong ears, and then all of a sudden their family members are being kidnapped, held for ransom, threatened, and it was just really, really dangerous. Everybody in Baghdad knew somebody who had been kidnapped or killed or tortured. It was a difficult, and to put that in context for folks out there who might not know the history, there were about, on average, for the year leading up to and described in the story, 3,000 deaths a month in Iraq, most of them in Baghdad, concentrated in Baghdad. So that is a 9/11 attack every month on the country of Iraq, to put that in perspective. That was the level of trauma that the country was suffering. So the book tells that story, and it talks about our relationship with our interpreters. And so that's the first 2/3 of the book, is Baghdad, surviving Baghdad, escaping Baghdad, getting to Amman. And then the final third of the book actually tells the story of what happens when about 36 of these interpreters get to the United States. And we just made the decision that any young, 20-year-old Iraqi who was going to the U.S. really did not understand what he was getting into. Their vision of America was formed in Hollywood, and they just didn't realize how hard it was going to be. So we required anybody who submitted a packet to have a sponsor. And most of those sponsors came from the soldiers who were supporting their interpreters, and they'd call their mom, they would call their wife or somebody back home who would be willing to sponsor this person. And so the final third of the book tells the story of those sponsors and the cultural assimilation that takes place. There's a lot of humor in that part, as you can imagine, with those types of stories. The U.S. of Al is sort of a CBS sitcom right now that's getting into or taking a humorous approach to that. And I'm a big fan, by the way. But that's the story in a nutshell, Jay. And it's been a labor of love for me. I still advocate on behalf of both Iraqis and Afghans, but also other vulnerable refugees that are out there, especially those who have American affiliations. And I'm just excited to use the book as a platform to be able to talk about what's going on in Afghanistan right now and advocate on behalf of the 17,000 plus interpreters in the backlog and the 70,000 family members that they represent. And that's really probably a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other at-risk folks in Afghanistan right now. And I'm just hopeful that our policy will be such that we can safeguard them.
Well, thank you, Steve. Really appreciate for giving us that background on your book, which, by the way, for all of you out there, is now available on Amazon.com. I believe it's formally being published or released over Memorial Day weekend. Is that correct?
Today is the release date.
Say again?
Today is the release date.
Today is the release date. Perfect. Well, we're honored to be a part of that. All right. Now we'd like to turn it over to you all for Q&A. Please use the chat function while you all queue up your questions. Why don't I start it off with a good prompting softball? Steve, could you kind of discuss very briefly some other historic examples of America dealing with this kind of issue? I know you went into a great deal of research going all the way back to the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, thanks. That was really a shocking episode to me, because when I delved into our Revolutionary War, it turned the problem on its head, right? We were the insurgents, essentially, the revolutionaries who were fighting the world superpower at the time. And we were doing exactly the same strategy that our adversaries do to the US today. We're fighting from a position of weakness, so we target their soft networks. And so we were tarring and feathering loyalists to the British Crown, enforcing public recantations of the Crown. And there was just a general public intimidation campaign going on. And that historical dive really helped me get a sense that this is a logical strategy that our enemies will pursue. And if it is a logical strategy, then we should have some strategy in place to proactively insulate our soft networks, to protect our most valuable partners in conflict zones. Anyway, so that was a great vignette. Vietnam, of course, there are a lot of Vietnam veterans right now who are joining the nonprofits or have been leading the way in the nonprofits who are advocating on behalf of Afghans, because they remember what happened when we withdrew from Vietnam to their Vietnamese partners. And to our credit, between 1975 and 1980, we had almost 250,000 Vietnamese emigrate. We relocated 130,000 to Guam. So if we could do that then, and if the British could relocate 60 to 70,000 loyalists out of the colonies over 200 years ago, then I think it's within our capability to evacuate 70,000 Afghans today.
Great, that's some really useful perspective. All right, Amanda Baker of CISA notes that she served in Afghanistan for all of 2019. As someone with 2 former linguists in the system now, and having been with them through this process from the very beginning, I can attest that this is an incredibly frustrating and disheartening process. One linguist is waiting on a piece of paper from Nebraska and was told it would take no less than 30 days. I have reached out to No One Left Behind, but their only recommendation is to reach out to my congressional reps. From your experience, is there a way to speed up the process, or do we just have to wait?
Thanks for that question, Amanda. This is an area that has been extremely frustrating, and this is why the nonprofits are advocating for an evacuation option, because at the height of efficiency for the SIV processing, we were only doing 4,000 a year. And we're not at that level now. Now, I know we've surged capacity back to Afghanistan to try to help, but it is a very complex process. there are something like 17 steps to the process, and it is just really difficult. One, because of the way we go to conflict, we contract this problem out. So your interpreters, Amanda, were probably hired by a defense contractor, and they have the personnel paperwork. And this was one of the things that I really explored in my thesis work was it's a triangular relationship here in our conflict zones. You, as a person on the ground in Afghanistan, have an implicit contract with the people who you're serving with the people you're going into harm's way with. And that implicit contract is based on an ethos. And that ethos has no one left behind in it. Your interpreters are hired by a defense contractor, which lets an explicit contract, and that's transactional. It's based on money and housing and any other details that are in the contract. They have the paperwork that you now need to honor your ethos of leave no one left behind. And many times it's difficult to get that paperwork. And I've tried this research to get it from defense contractors out there. It's been very difficult. They are worried about liability because they are held to, by law, the Defense Base Act. And that requires them to provide the same reporting that they would of any American that they hire to their third country nationals that they hire. That reporting is supposed to go to the Department of Labor, and DOL posts it publicly. However, the data is almost useless to be able to make any sense of it because DOL has no teeth to enforce the law. And so it's a real challenge that we have in that space, the opaqueness. The one recommendation I would have for you, Amanda, is if you haven't reached out to IRAP already, I would reach out to them, the International Refugee Assistance Project. They are the lawyers who are able to navigate some of these channels in the refugee space. And they've been very effective with class action lawsuits as well as advocacy. If they take cases pro bono. The problem with that is its capacity. They can only take so many cases. And so, but if they're able to take your case, they might be able to help. No One Left Behind, their advice to reach out to your member of Congress is absolutely spot on as well. This has widespread bipartisan support on the Hill. So I would be very surprised if your member of Congress would not be willing to assist in helping move your individual cases along. And I'm sorry for the lengthy answer on that, but it's super complex and challenging. And that's one of the things that I know the current administration is attempting to streamline. We tried it when I worked on the Obama administration as well, to streamline the process. It's really challenging in a post 9/11 environment, and I'll just leave it at that.
Great. We have one quick note from Christy Bea at Marine Corps University Quantico, saying that your book is going on the shelves at their library, which is a prompt for us to ensure that it goes on the shelves of the National Defense University library.
Jay, if I could just say, can I just say thank you to Christy. Christy helped me when I taught national security at Marine Corps University. She's one of the librarians there. She is just a wonderful human being and was so supportive as I started publishing in this space on soft networks. So thank you, Christy.
A good reminder that while the nature of libraries may change in the digital age, the need for good librarians does not go away. Amanda Baker had a follow-up question regarding locals who are employed to assist the mission on the base, local merchants and those kinds of things, and ask, was employing locals in Iraq a similar practice, and were there instances of violence against the non-linguist, or is any similar protection being offered to them?
That's a great question, Amanda. So I do go into a vignette on that in the book, and I referred to one of those individuals, Nadal. He was killed 2 weeks after my interpreter was killed. Nadal was a beloved store owner. I was on a very small U.S. base inside of a large Iraqi base in Qadamiyah in Baghdad. And so we had a small contingent of Americans. It was a very complex mission. We had over 50 interpreters that lived with us full time. And the number fluctuated, but just over 100 Americans on different transition teams, in my small task force, as well as some civilian counterparts as well from DOJ and elsewhere. So the challenge for us was, we were trying to empower the Iraqi economy. We were trying to hopefully allow the political institutions and the economic activity to regain normalcy so that we could work ourselves out of a job. And the enemy understood that as well. And so by virtue of Nadal working on an American base, when he was finally found out by the Jaish al-Mahdi, they killed him as a result of that. And it was because of his American affiliation. And many Iraqis are still in harm's way. I believe from the numbers I'm seeing from the nonprofit world, there are more Iraqis in a backlog, and there is no SIV now available to them. If they did not apply for the SIV by 2014, it twilighted because we pulled out of Iraq in 2011. So who would ever think we'd go back? So now they have to pursue other options out of Iraq, and the number is somewhere over 100,000 Iraqis are at risk. But thank you for that question. That's why the definition of soft networks is broader than interpreters. And many of my nonprofit colleagues use the term wartime allies to be more broadly encompassing.
Certainly underlines the complexity of this issue. Gil Sanborn has asked if you could talk a little bit about the process of writing, some of the twists and turns, what you learned about yourself. And from my standpoint, could you also kind of talk a little bit about what we had discussed the other day, the Writers Guild project and other similar projects to assist veterans who are attempting to capture their experience through writing?
Great question. Thank you, Gil. Gil's a dear friend. He's a civilian assistant secretary to the Army for the state of California. So just an amazing advocate for veterans, and has done that across the country ever since 9/11. So thank you. The book, actually, proceeds for the book go to the U.S. Veteran Artists Alliance. And USVAA is a nonprofit, educational nonprofit that supports veteran writers, many aspiring screenwriters who are hoping to get into the film industry, family members, and others in government as well, to tell their stories. And so they are affiliated with the Writers Guild Foundation in LA, which represents, as you know, the Writers Guild represents screenwriters in LA, and the foundation does a lot of the nonprofit work to support screenwriters. And they have a veteran writers program. And I was fortunate enough to get accepted into the program. I wasn't an aspiring screenwriter, but I was. They knew I was writing a book, and I was really struggling. I was, and the reason I was struggling, Jay, is because I was trying to write the way you taught me. I was trying to write academic stuff, you and the other CISA faculty, and because I had published in scholarly journals and stuff like that. And I was trying to talk about all the policy while I was trying to tell this story of Iraq. And what I realized by virtue of the mentors, the amazing mentors that I had in the Writers Guild Foundation, was that I was trying to write two books at once. I was trying to write all the policy stuff, and I was also trying to tell a good story. And when I had that epiphany, and I decided, let me just focus on the story, because writing one book is a good way to ruin all your time management. It really started to flow. And I'm just so grateful to USVAA, my publisher, the editor. They've assembled a team. Many are veterans or military brats who they're supporting. The cover art was done by an Air Force veteran, Jamie Peterson. They're just wonderful, and they really coached me. And I was somebody who published before. I just didn't publish this way. So it was a long process, a long journey.
Indeed, the loneliness of the long distance writer. So I'm glad that question came up. I want to encourage anybody who's in the audience who is working on similar projects to reach out to the foundation. Also, those of you who are local in DC, I know for a number of years, the Writing Center in Bethesda, Maryland, was supporting similar efforts, which I believe were tied in with the Writers Guild. I may be wrong on that point. But those of you who have a story to tell, I encourage you to avail yourself of the opportunity to tap these resources and ensure your story gets told. Todd Kushner raises another point. He said, you mentioned the need for other policy options other than the Special Immigrant Visa Program. But in the Refugee Crisis in Iraq Act of 2007, we also added a provision qualifying Iraqis who work for the U.S. government for P2 refugee status. Why has this P2 provision not been taken advantage of? And is the SIV program probably overemphasized? And could you explain a little bit about what the P2 program means?
Well, thanks for that question, Todd. Number one, I'm not an immigration lawyer, and I don't understand all that stuff. That's why I call people at IRAP who are lawyers. They're incredible in this space. Anyway, so the policy that I worked on, it goes beyond the SIV, right? And it's not so much in the immigration space like the P2. It's protecting people proactively, right? It's protecting identity in advance. It's doing less harm basically by raising awareness amongst us as well as our indigenous partners, right? That if you work alongside of us, you will be targeted. And part of it is just the way we go to combat. We're going in thinking, okay, we're the good guys. We're seeing the world in black and white a little bit, and you know, who would want to target our friends, you know? And so we go in, and all of a sudden, our friends start getting killed, and we don't have options available. Oh, and we might have posted a good photo of our buddy next to us in uniform on Facebook, or the Iraqi or Afghan did on Facebook because they don't know any better. Now they do. Now everybody gets it. But in the next conflict zone, it might be different, and we'll have different operators head into the field. So protecting identity is the first step. And there are many different ways to do that. It's both in physical force protection of how we bring people onto our bases and how we think about their needs to either live and transit back and forth from where they live, or those are the things that we need to be proactively thinking about, because our adversaries absolutely are. They are following interpreters' kids home from school and dropping an envelope on the doorstep with a bullet in it and a nice letter stating what's going to happen if you continue to work for the occupiers. And so identity protection is the first step. It involves training us, our departments and agencies that are deploying to the field, as well as our indigenous partners who we hire. And because we hire them with defense contractors, we need to make sure they're part of that training process as well and on board. So it's pretty complex from that space. Now, if identity protection fails, then it becomes a game of relocation. But really what we want to try to do is relocate internally inside the country, if at all possible. And that's where the defense contractors can really play a critical role because they can reassign people based on risk and threat assessment. And maybe if you're in Mogadishu and it gets too hot, you get reassigned to Puntland up north, where it's a little bit more stable. And you're still part of the mission, but you're just not at risk. And but it becomes a game of really better understanding the human terrain and relocating when required. And then if we need to, if the threat is that risky where they can't stay in country, hopefully regionally to another culture that is similar, so it's not such an assimilation challenge. But if that's still difficult, like I'll give the example of Iraqi Air Force pilots. While we were in Iraq in 2005, there was an Iranian campaign to assassinate Iraqi Air Force pilots, and we didn't figure it out until 100 pilots were already dead. If we relocated them somewhere else, the Iranians could probably get to them somewhere else in the Middle East or somewhere else in Iraq. They could still probably get to them. So maybe an extreme relocation like Australia or Europe or Canada, the US, would be the better option for individuals that had that specific risk profile. Anyway, it's those are the types of things that I get into with the policy stuff. On the P2 visa, I would defer to IRAP and ask them for their thoughts, and they've got a great policy team as well, and they do a lot of advocacy.
All right. Eric asked, what can we learn from other countries and how they were able to affect the withdrawal of the soft network personnel while we are still on the ground and need their support? Obviously, as he notes, let's not recreate wheels that already exist.
Great question, Eric. And so there are, well, number one, I would say all countries are struggling with this. And I've had colleagues in the UK, Germany, they're struggling. France, they have the same similar challenges. And there are public campaigns, mainly led by their veteran populations, to advocate on behalf of Afghans in that particular example. The Dutch relocated all of their interpreters and their families out of Iraq. And I want to say that was in 2008. Now, that was a small scale. It was in the hundreds, right? We're not talking a large number. But they did that. So that's an extreme relocation. The British had a program in Afghanistan where they would offer money once a threat was validated that an interpreter and their family or another Afghan partner was at risk. They would provide money that would allow them to relocate somewhere else in Afghanistan. Now, there's a lot of criticism that wasn't enough in Great Britain, but at least it's another policy option. And my perspective is, let's have as many policy tools as possible in the kit bag so that our operators in the field can pick and choose what works in the instances they find themselves confronted in. Because policymakers back in DC, we're not going to be able to figure it out in time to solve the problems that emerge in the field, as those of us who have been in the field know.
All right. Andy Christian notes, what are some of the capabilities and strategies that you feel would be useful to implement in country prior to bringing allies here, or when doing so isn't possible?
Yeah, so did you say Andy Christian?
Yes.
Thanks for that question, Andy. Andy is a longtime friend from Iraq. We drove around together and got in trouble quite a bit. So thank you for being here. So the most important thing, I think, revolves around the principle of identity protection, and that's in the physical space as well as in the cyberspace. And the cyber training should be just part of our go-to-war package. both for our military, our diplomats, our government contractors, as well as our indigenous allies that we hire. That is something that's super important. And I know, unfortunately, a lot of our indigenous partners learned it the hard way. I get a lot of direct messages on Twitter or notes on LinkedIn from people in duress. And they're basically, you know, they're in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they are not able to publicly comment for fear that they will be found out. And so they get it. And that's the type of understanding that we need to go to war with and operate within a conflict zone. And that's how we need to be frank about when we hire people, that these are the risks they could potentially be associated to, and their families could be at risk. And I go into one of the stories in the book I go into is Ronnie is one of the main characters throughout the entire book. That was his combat nickname. I know Andy knows Ronnie. Just a wonderful guy. His first day on the job, he showed up in white pants and a dress shirt that he was going to wear to college because he was still attending classes at the time. Nobody told him that was not appropriate. You're going to stand out. And then he found out very quickly that he was taking on a dangerous job, and very quickly he started, number one, not telling his parents what he did. He would hide, all the Iraqis would hide their badge to access the base and get on and off base, because if anybody found that on the outside, they could be at risk. So there's just basic operational security stuff that we should drill into our force as well as anybody we bring on. And those are the things we really need to be thinking about, you know, short of some sort of extreme relocation.
Great. Joe, pardon me, Joe Haddad says, good evening from Lebanon. Getting back to the recruitment process, as most of the social issues in the Middle East societies are built on clans, tribal ties, one way to preserve their later, to prevent against later retaliation against these interpreters, would have been to reach out to the head of the major tribes for prior agreements on recruiting. And because of the laws of retaliation which run among the clans and tribes, it might have created a kind of local protection for these interpreters. Is that your experience, or do you know of any examples where that was tried?
No, it's a great point, and I agree with the point. I do not know of any examples where that was tried. It was, you know, Iraq at the time was in civil war. We weren't supposed to use that term, but those of us in the field did, because that's what it was. You know, 3,000 casualties a month, where people were being brought to torture houses, and power drills were being put in their knees and their heads before they were dumped in the street for somebody to come find. And the morgues were just a needle in a haystack problem. The bodies were piling up, and family members were at risk of being tortured if they went to try to identify their deceased loved one. So trust was at a real low, and you know, I would hope that in future conflicts we would go in with a little bit more cultural awareness, but that was not the case in Iraq. I'm not familiar with how it worked in Afghanistan, but I absolutely concur with the point. You know, maybe we did a lot of hiring that way with the Sons of Iraq, which were the Anbar Awakening, the Sunni resistance to Al-Qaeda, which eventually ran Al-Qaeda of Iraq underground before they morphed into ISIS. And most of those contracts were done via dealing with tribal sheikhs and hiring, 50, 100 tribe members and providing security and other services for a particular area. And so we learned that in some areas, but I did not see that with interpreters.
Interesting note on cultural preparation of the battlefield, worth noting. Todd Kushner has posted some details in the chat, which I would commend to you all, that give some of the background on how the laws were written with interpreters in mind. So those of you in the audience may want to take a look at that. Both Everett Spain and Eric Stetson bring up Task Force Justice. Eric mentions that we had a brother of an interpreter shot by the JAM. He came to us for help, and all our soldiers were in favor of getting him to the green zone. So he did so despite official MNCI policy at the time. Everett notes, thank you so much for your leadership in the Army and specifically on this issue. Have we ever considered asking corporations if they may be interested in creating a pipeline to provide paid but low-risk internships for former interpreters, which might lead to full-time employment? Wonder if anyone would be interested. Though every interpreter is different, they had very high emotional intelligence, cross-cultural competence, persuasion skills, and obviously multilingual. Could you kind of comment on just what Task Force Justice was, and respond also to kind of the 2 points there, Eric's point of having to work at odds with competing policies in country, and then Everett's point about making use of corporate networks in this country as part of the relocation process.
Well, thanks. Eric was my right-hand man in Task Force Justice as the deputy, and Everett was the base commander back in Germany on my third combat deployment. So I'm just really grateful to both of them for their service. As you know, it's a team sport, and everybody's got to play their position on a team, and they were exceptional in their roles. Task Force Justice was a provisional task force inside the Dagger Brigade combat team. So the Dagger Brigade was 4,000 plus soldiers cobbled together. Eventually, it would entail 15 different battalion task forces that have been rotating in and out because there was so much complexity with battalions and brigades being chopped in different directions. So many of our subordinate elements did not hail from Germany. They hailed from the United States. We had no idea who they were as they were showing up, and we received them or inherited them when we arrived. So it was super complex to even see ourselves. Task Force Justice was pulled from across the brigade combat team to perform basically an intelligence and logistics role at FOB Justice, Forward Operating Base Justice, which was the little American enclave inside of a larger Iraqi base. The base was called Adala, which is justice in Arabic, and it's where it had 3 different detention centers on it. The Ministry of Justice, where capital punishment occurred, was on FOB Justice. An Iraqi National Police Division was based there with a large facility that housed over 300 inmates, although at times there were 900 kept in there. And then an Iraqi Army Brigade also had a detention center there. So providing understanding of that to the American forces was part of the mission, as well as equipping almost a dozen transition teams, either military transition teams for the Army, National Police transition teams, or a Department of Justice team that was covered down on the Ministry of Justice facility where capital punishment occurred, they all resided on FOB Justice, and we were providing them with intelligence and logistics support, as well as I served in a dual role. I was the deputy commander of the brigade at the time as well, so we spent a lot of time out and about with the other units to make sure we understood what the challenges were within Northwest Baghdad. So anyway, Eric, as you know, we didn't let official policy get in the way of doing what we felt was right. I did refer to giving interpreters weapons after they were qualified, and we felt they wanted it and they could defend themselves. That was not necessarily official policy. We helped an Iraqi family get out. They were not interpreters. As you know, there was no real legal way we could do that, and we tried to get approval all the way up the chain of command to General Petraeus as well as Ambassador Crocker, and they both said, there are no options that we can offer you. And so we pursued a different option and got the family to Turkey. That's in the book, and they were a sticky case because they didn't have a sponsor, and I ended up doing what a lot of soldiers do. I called my mom and I said, "Mom, I need help. I need a sponsor for this Iraqi general and his 5 kids and his 2 wives, one of which he married a month before we moved the family out." So anyway, all that's detailed in the book. It's there. Everett, I'm working with the defense community and the contractors. There's a nonprofit called the International Stability Operations Association. Howie Lynn and I are close, and we're looking at ways where we can involve the defense contracting community in whatever policy options get developed and allow them to be part of the solution, because they are very much a key player in the way we go to war now. And so it's a great point, and it's a little convoluted and complex the way we go to war, but we're trying to work with what we've got.
Great. Let me see if I can roll up 2 of our last questions here so that we can get to them. Also, a side note, one of our absolutely super librarians, library staff at NDU, notes here that the book is on order. So once we're all back on campus, line up at the circulation desk so that you can be sure to read it. Connor Clark asked, what trends did you notice and why interpreters and other soft-net workers signed up to take such a risky job, and what are the stories about their motives that surprised you? And Sarah Matthews notes, based on her own experience in working with Iraqi staff while serving in Erbil, that one of the challenges faced was recruitment of women for staff. And women were vitally important in the success of her particular mission, and I can think of lots of other examples where they were. How might the lens of gender overlay with the issues of protection, education, and is this something you discuss in the book?
Yeah, great question. So on the question of motive, I would just, and this is not a cop-out, but it's complex, right? I think early on in the conflict, there was more idealism, and then at points there might have been more economic incentive, and maybe those are the 2 main motives. But why does anybody take a job? There are different variables you're trying to balance in the positions that you take, and so that's super complex. I've explored a little bit of it. On the point about women, as you know, it's a challenging culture, especially depending on where you are. If you're in the more rural areas, it's much more male-dominated. The urban environments tend to be more equalitarian, but women play an absolutely vital role. I don't go into it from the perspective of interpreters in the book, but I do talk about the role that female sponsors played in the U.S. And every sponsor that I spotlight in the book is a courageous woman who opened their doors to these young Iraqi men who were coming in. And I'll give you one example. Madonna from Tucson, she was a widow. Her only son was deployed to Baghdad, and he called his mom and he said, Mom, I need you to help Ronnie. He needs a sponsor. And she said, of course. And then she went to work the next day, and all of her girlfriends at work thought she was nuts. They said, have you lost your mind? You're going to let some strange Arab male come live in your house? You're a single woman. Because of the post 9/11 sort of hyper terrorism perspective that we have, that's what people are exposed to in the media. And Madonna pushed back. She said, I know my son would not put me at risk. And she said, when I first laid eyes on Ronnie and picked him up at the airport, I knew he was going to be a second son to me. And sure enough, Ronnie did what all sons do to their moms. He broke her heart. He enlisted in the Army, and he deployed back to combat. So both of her sons were in combat. But I do get into some of that and the importance of women. And there's a historical analogy as well. The title Baghdad Underground Railroad is very intentional. There are lots of parallels to the historical Underground Railroad. There's obviously differences there as well, but one of the interesting parallels was that was one of the first times in the United States where women operated on an equal level with men. They were taking equal risk. They were safeguarding runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad, and women played a critical part in the Baghdad Underground Railroad as well, especially at the final stop.
Well, Steve, this has been fascinating and inspiring. Kind of taking a comment in the chat section from someone, Roman Janju, nation, America can be stronger for knowing about this, and hopefully based on your book, your efforts, and the efforts of others along with you, working toward a resolution that is consistent with certainly with our ethos and how we have represented our broader interest in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the world. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you, Ambassador Holtz, for joining us and giving that very valuable contextual introduction. Please join me in a virtual round of applause for our alum, Steve. And those of you who may have additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat function, and I will pass them on to Steve for use later and response later. Thank you, Steve. Bravo. And
thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the support.